Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marlon Prime, I'm the president of the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association. I'm also an assistant U.S. attorney for the past 26 years. I want to thank Carrie Burns and all the staff of the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association for all their work, not only on this project, but so many other projects that make our bar association what it is today. We have a great and timely topic today, talking about the government shutdown and the implications of that. We have a stellar panel in front of us. So I'm just going to go ahead and introduce our panel. First, we have Milena Stereo. She's a professor of law and the associate dean for academic enrichment at Cleveland Marshall College of Law. She specializes in international law, human rights, international criminal law, immigration law, and national security law. She has her JD from Cornell University, magna cum laude. She also has her master's from the University of Paris, and she had her undergraduate degree from Rutgers University. To my far right, we have Joseph White. He's the Luxembourg Family Professor of Public Policy in the Department of Political Science at Case Western Reserve University right here in Cleveland. He earned his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, before coming to CSU in 2000. He's had a distinguished career at the Brookings Institution and a number of other places. He's testified before Congress on budgeting issues, so we're very happy to have Professor Joseph White with us today. Also, to my immediate right, we have Commander Brendan Gavin with us today. He currently is assigned as a staff judge advocate for the 9th Coast Guard District, which covers the Great Lakes region of the United States, including the states of Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. Commander Gavin oversees the provision of all 9th District legal services, including investigations into environmental crimes, violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, ethics, fiscal law, employment law, claims, intelligence and information law, legal assistance, field regulations, and other operational and personal issues. Commander Gavin received his law degree from Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, and he's a member of the Massachusetts Bar. So help me in welcoming all of our panelists today. As a federal employee, I'd be remiss for not saying a few words about the shutdown and its personal impact, where our panelists are going to talk more about some personal issues as it relates to the shutdown and a lot of legal and technical issues. But I think it's very important to really take a step back and really talk about where we are in terms of the shutdown. One of the things that I'm speaking for myself and my colleagues that are federal employees, that really unnerves us to be used as pawns in a political battle. And the reason why that's problematic is against the trend as it relates to civil service reform. And you have to, in order to really understand it, you have to understand where we've come from. It used to be at the U.S. Attorney's Office and also a number of other federal agencies that you had to interview at the political office, the Democratic or Republican office, in order to get a job at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And the problem with that approach is that during a presidential year, everyone that was a career or a lower level employee would be focusing on their best interest of getting a new job. So a lot wouldn't get done in the presidential year. So with respect to civil service reform, the thought was that that's not good for the entire federal government and not good for the people that we serve, because you could have hundreds of thousands of people looking for jobs as opposed to really focusing on their job of serving the public. So as a consequence, there's civil service reform, the Hatch Act, and all of these things were attempted to take politics out of the federal workforce. And so now when we have federal employees kind of used as pawns in a political battle, it takes politics back into the federal workforce, and it really does it to the detriment of the federal workers, and also it does it to the detriment of the clients that we serve. The other very important thing as it relates to the shutdown that you don't see a lot in the media is the devastating impact it will have on current and future federal employees. As a result of civil service reform, you have just the first generation, so to speak, of federal workers that were career. There's always a situation with those at the top, like the U.S. Attorney and some of his immediate staff. They could be replaced with this president, and the same would be true from agencies. But the move in terms of civil service reform is that the overwhelming majority of just line assistant U.S. attorneys and support staff, they would not be impacted. When you have this political upheaval, when you have individuals missing paychecks as a result of the shutdown, that really deters young people from coming into these jobs, because right now our federal workforce is growing. Most of the people, not most, but a large number of the federal workforce are at or near retirement. So if we're discouraging people from coming into federal service as a result of the shutdown, you're looking at a potential crisis on the horizon. So it's our hope that that message will get out, and that this will be a red line. So irrespective of your politics, you say, hey, this is not in the best interest of the country. The other thing that's really important from a personal perspective is I can recall my time during the 1995 shutdown. I was a young attorney, been married for 4 years. My wife was 9 months pregnant, ready to deliver my youngest child at any moment. And at that same time, I had a trial. As it relates to the shutdown, I had to worry about not only focusing on the trial, but focusing in on whether or not I'm going to be able to put food on the table, whether or not I was going to be able to pay for child care for my son, who was 3 years old. Child care at that time was $700 a week. Or my insurance, they were paid with each check. So I had to worry about whether or not my insurance was lapsed. So those issues that impacted me when I had children, those are issues that really impacted the entire federal workforce when they didn't get paid for 35 days. Instead of focusing on a laser about doing their job and doing justice, they have to focus on some of these ancillary issues. So it's not good in terms of keeping them in their jobs and then getting a whole new rung of federal employees to replace them. The other thing that's really important that I don't think really gets across in some of the media conversation is that we can have a debate about whether the government has gotten too large. I understand that debate, people on both sides of it, but we have to kind of deal with the here and now in terms of where we're at. The government, the federal government, which all federal attorneys represent, is practically the largest landowner, largest landlord, largest mortgage holder, debt collector. And so when you have a shutdown, the entire civil division is shut down, this doesn't do the public any good. So in addition, hurting the fact of being able to get new people to fill these jobs, it doesn't serve the public, because when you're dealing with that types of money, you want the best and the brightest, and you want to make sure that it's not harming the public or the entire judiciary. And my final point, before I turn it over to the panel, is that as it relates to the last shutdown, we were only a few days away from the federal judiciary losing all funding. And just think about the devastating consequences of that. They had the same issues that I'm talking about in terms of encouraging young people to service law courts and support staff. So if you're saying that you're going to lose paychecks and you're not going to be paid, that's going to be discouraging those that are going to be providing assistance to our federal judges to carry out the very important work that they're doing. So in short, I just hope that from all of what has occurred during the 1995 shutdown and all the other shutdowns, is that we'll be able to come together as Democrats, Republicans, or whatever political ideology, and just basically say, hey, this is a red line, that our federal judiciary, our federal workforce is just very, very important. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to our panel. We have an outstanding panel. And so I'll start with the professor to kind of give us a little overview.
Does this work? Is it on? Okay. So I work on budget processes, among other things. And so I've watched shutdowns a lot of times and written about them somewhat. And so I think my role here is to say a little about shutdowns as part of budgeting, of federal budgeting. And so the first thing to emphasize is that the Constitution says that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, which is pretty straightforward, except isn't actually, it gets messed up after a while, but if there is no appropriation by law, then then it sounds from the Constitution like it shouldn't be possible to pay people for doing work. That's the basic point here. Now, in fact, we managed to go through about 190 years of American history without quite getting to the point of people not getting paid because of an absence of appropriations. There have been times in the past when there were absence of appropriations weren't made in time and so on, but never for very long. But then in the at the end of the 1970s, there were a series of situations where there was no agreement. And in 1980, the then Attorney General, Benjamin Civiletti, in the Carter administration, got posed the question of exactly what are you allowed to do when there isn't an appropriation. And he said basically, well, with certain exceptions, what were then known as essential and then later became known as accepted employees, people can't come to work. And in general, even the accepted employees who would come to work because their work involved the health or safety of Americans, they couldn't get paid until it was legitimate to pay them. So they could come to work, but they couldn't get paid. And then there's a series of exceptions where maybe the appropriation hasn't been made, but there's money sloshing around anyway that's still in the possession of the agency. A good example is the federal courts, which collect fees and might have money left over at the end of the year anyway, but they've got some income coming in that isn't appropriated money. So there's a series of exceptions where people can get paid, but generally, basic problem is the appropriations bills haven't been passed, and therefore a substantial portion of the employees covered by those bills can't get paid, and some of them have to work anyway, and some of them don't. So why don't appropriations bills get passed? This, of course, has bothered Congress people too, and the main reason why, and it's bothered presidents, and the main reason why appropriations bills don't get passed is other Congress people. Or if you're Congress, the president, or if you're the president, the Congress. There's disagreement. And we are continually saying, well, we should force action. But the problem with forcing action is it usually involves creating some sort of consequence of inaction other than the shutdown. And in the context of the shutdown, we often say, well, we should force it, people should just settle. But the problem with that argument, as with many other situations where you've got hostage taking in politics, is that each side thinks the other should settle. The other is responsible for the problem. I mean, President Trump doesn't look like that the Democrats not funding the wall, and therefore a shutdown, and say, okay, so I should concede. Like that's not a reasonable way for most human beings to act. Say, I've been constrained, and therefore I should concede. Now, most people think that the negative consequence means the other guy should give in. And this is true in debt ceiling fights, it's true in shutdown fights of other sorts, it's true with the sequesters that were threatened by the Grand Weapon Haulings Law, it was true with the sequesters that were threatened by the Budget Control Act of 2011. The continual response, having some sort of horrible consequence doesn't make people settle. At least not automatically. Now there was just a Congress, there was just an effort within Congress to improve the budget process. There was a joint select committee on budget appropriation process reform. And one of the things that they addressed, they had to reach total bipartisan agreement. Majorities of the members of the committee from House Democrats, House Republicans, Senate Democrats, and Senate Republicans had to agree. They couldn't get that. But one of the things they talked about is the problem of continuing resolutions, of not being able to pass the regular appropriations bills on time, and sometimes even getting to the point of shutdown. And there were various proposals for creating some sort of default, such as, well, if there's no appropriation and no continuing resolution, then we'll just spend it the same rate as last year, or last year minus 2%, or last year plus 2%, or whatever. And the problem with that is every such deal favors somebody. every default favors somebody. And you might well be, and I think this was the conclusion of at least some of the people who testified in the committee, if you had a default other than shutdown, other than non-appropriation, you'd be more likely to never get an annual appropriation bill again for a whole bunch of agencies, because there would be, so for instance, conservative Republicans would in general think, great, so we've frozen government spending for the foreseeable future. And so, or if you have a president who's trying to cut spending, Democrats might think, great, if we don't pass anything at all, then we get last year's spending. So the problem in all of this stuff is that the bargaining situations that are created, none of them are really desirable. So I just want to emphasize, first of all, that this comes out of the Constitution. Secondly, that most of the rules about shutdown were sort of invented in 1980 in response, by the Attorney General at the time. Those were then, by the way, somewhat codified in the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990. So there is some legislative background for how things are done. And that people in Congress are very aware of these problems. But in any given bargaining situation, whether you're dealing with the consequences of a shutdown, which are bad, or some other default, which are obviously going to be undesirable to somebody, the default does not necessarily cause action. Right now, what's going on is a situation where basically, by the way, they managed to pass the big appropriations bills back in September and October. Back in September, they passed labor HHS, they passed defense. That's more than 2/3 of the government right there. Okay, but there's a bunch of other stuff they didn't pass, and that's basically been hung up in this fight about the wall, which is a somewhat symbolic fight, but became a partisan fight where Republicans are not willing to override their president's veto. That's basically what's going on, even if they don't much like the wall. And there's no logical constitutional solution to a problem like that. People want to go to the wall and get so big on something, there's nothing much you can do to force action.
That's a stereo.
Sure. So I would like to use my time to briefly address three different points. So I would like to use my time to briefly address three different points. One, immigration. Two, presidential powers and the ability of the president to declare a national emergency under the Constitution, under federal law. And then three, lawsuits that have been filed by some federal employees and federal employee unions under the Anti-Deficiency Act. So first, immigration, just to kind of give you a snapshot of what's going on in terms of immigration to the United States, with a particular focus obviously on the southern border. So right now in the United States, there are approximately 10.7 million of undocumented illegal immigrants. Obviously, you have to take this with a grain of salt. That number is not exactly precise, because I do think that there are undocumented immigrants that we don't know they're here, but the number, most organizations that specialize in immigration think that this number is basically accurate. That number has been fairly steady over the last decade. That number has not sharply increased. When you look at the number of border apprehensions at our southern border, that number has actually gone fairly drastically down. So back in 2006, we had about 1 million border apprehensions at the southern border. That number went down to about 300,000 in 2017, and that number has gone a little bit up in 2018. And in 2018, I think we were at like 370 or 380,000 border apprehensions. So the number is up a little bit. However, the number in historical comparison is still drastically down from back in 2006. Now, there are more individuals trying to enter the United States from countries such as Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador than in the past, but again, the net numbers are really fairly steady, and the net numbers have actually decreased over the years. In terms of, President Trump has made these arguments about the immigrants who are trying to come in as either criminals or drug people carrying drugs with them or engaged in the drug trade. When you look at studies that have been conducted about crime rates among immigrant communities as compared to the general population, those studies significantly show that the crime rates are actually lower among immigrants. And there's a recent study by the Cato Institute that looks at crime rates in Texas, where there are many immigrants and many undocumented immigrants. And that study showed that when it comes to murder, rape, burglary, violent crimes, the crime rates are significantly lower among the immigrant population. So it's simply not true that immigrants are somehow engaging in violent crime much more so than the general population. The opposite is actually true. They're actually engaging in crime in significantly fewer numbers. And then when you look at the drugs, President Trump has also made this argument that drugs are pouring into our southern border. While that may be true, all sorts of studies and data show that the drugs are actually coming into legal ports of entry. They're not coming in with illegal immigrants who cross through a desert or swim across the river. So even there were recent drug busts, if you will, just a few weeks ago, where large amounts of drugs were found in a truck. Well, that truck was actually attempting to enter the United States through a legal port of entry. So a wall, I know this is not just about but a wall would certainly not prevent large amounts of drugs from pouring in, even if that were true. And then the other thing is, some of the other arguments that have been made here is that is there terrorists coming into the southern border? That's also facts do not support that argument at all. Out of most of the suspected terrorists who entered the United States from abroad, enter through legal ports of entry. Most of them enter through by air or by sea. Most of them do not enter by crossing the desert. And there have been only really a handful of suspected terrorists who entered through our southern border. So with that in mind, one of the things that we have certainly had to ponder over the last few weeks or in the last few months is whether President Trump would actually declare a national emergency in order to then access funds that would otherwise not be available to him to construct a wall. So would that be legal? Could he do it, and would that be legal? So under the Constitution, when it comes to our presidential powers, there's relevant Supreme Court precedent, and the most famous case here is the Youngstown case, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. In that case, which goes back to 1952, the Supreme Court held that President Truman could not seize steel mills, because at the time, this is during the Korean War, and there was a labor strike, and President Truman tried to seize the operation of steel mills because we needed steel mills to work so that they could produce weapons needed for the war effort. And the Supreme Court said, no, the president did not have this implicit constitutional authority to do so because he was really acting against the wishes of Congress. And what's really most famous about that case is the concurring opinion by Justice Jackson. I'm sure all of you have heard of Justice Jackson, and I tell my students, he actually never went to law school. I don't know how many of you do that. He actually never went to law school. He was back in the day, you could actually go to undergraduate and then be an apprentice at a law firm, go to the judge, and then take the bar. So he never went to law school. I don't know why I tell them that. Encouraging them to go to law school. But Justice Jackson wrote this concurring opinion, which is very famous, where he set up this tripartite scheme in terms of presidential authority. And he said that the president, when he acts pursuant to the wishes of Congress, that's when his powers are at their highest peak. If the president is acting in a situation where we don't really know what Congress thinks, then we're in what Justice Jackson called the zone of twilight. And then if the president is acting against congressional wishes, that's when the presidential power is at its lowest ebb. And so how do we apply that to the current situation? Well, although some folks on the sort of other side of the aisle, where those who support President Trump, I should say that way, have argued that Congress has actually already authorized funding for some fencing. So back in 2006, Congress actually authorized funds under this, there's a federal act that was passed that authorized the construction of limited fencing over our southern border. And so some people say today, well, that is an indication that Congress actually agrees with that. But I would say that fast forward to 2018, it is crystal clear to me that Congress doesn't agree with this, right? And that's why we have a shutdown. And so I would say that the president's actions today would be in this category of where his powers are at their lowest ebb. I should mention, though, that in addition to the Youngstown case, there is another famous Supreme Court case called Davis and Moore, which is a more recent case from 1981, where the Supreme Court actually held that President Reagan has the constitutional authority to implement the so-called Algiers Accords, which are accords that ended the Iranian hostage crisis. So in that case, the Supreme Court actually gave deference to the executive branch, but in an area that really squarely fell within the conduct of foreign relations. I would say that the current situation, the wall issues are very, very different, and we're not dealing as much with the conduct of foreign relations as we were in the War case. Now, so that's under the Constitution. Now, what about under federal law? So there's a federal law dating back to 1976 called the National Emergencies Act, which was actually passed in the post-Watergate era, and the intent was actually to rein in presidential powers. That act allows the president to declare a national emergency, but that act sadly doesn't really define what a national emergency is. And so presidents have used this act, and since the Carter administration, there have been 31 national emergencies that have been declared by our president, but some of those emergencies have involved situations like, for example, the Iran hostage crises, like 9/11, right? Situations that I would say are drastically different from what we're dealing with today. Now, if the president declares a national emergency under the National Emergencies Act of 1976, what that means is the president has to tell Congress that he's declaring a national emergency, and then the president has to tell Congress which other federal statutes the president is relying on to then do something pursuant to those national emergency powers. And the Brennan Center at NYU has identified 123 statutes which contain provisions which allow the president to do something if the president invokes a national emergency. And out of those 123 statutes, I think there are 2 statutes that are relevant for this situation. So the first is Title VII, Section 2808. This section allows the Secretary of Defense to undertake military construction projects that are necessary to support the use of armed forces. And here, the Secretary of Defense can actually use funds that have already been authorized for the Department of Defense, but haven't been earmarked for a different purpose. But in order to use this provision, the President would have to show the Secretary of Defense that we have a situation that requires the use of armed forces, and that the military construction project that may be authorized is necessary to support the use of armed forces. And so when it comes to border security, many scholars and commentators have pointed out that typically ICE, immigration, customs authorities, this is a civilian function, right? This is not a military function, and so that it's a stretch to make this argument that somehow securing the border requires the use of armed forces. And even if you argue that this requires the use of armed forces, it is then a stretch to argue that the wall is necessary to support the use of armed forces. People have pointed out that you could, even if you said you need armed forces, you could support the armed forces by having more agents down there, by having better technology, by having limited fencing in areas where we really need it, but not by having a 2,000-mile wall, which many think is not exactly necessary. Now, the second section that's relevant here is Title 33, Section 2293, which basically provides for the reallocation of funds for civil works during national emergencies. Now, this section is basically a reprogramming authority, which allows the Secretary of Defense to reallocate funding between projects, but not to undertake new unauthorized projects. And in addition, this section requires these projects to be essential to the national defense. And so here, 2 scholars have pointed out that, first of all, this section, if you're going to use this section, you can't use money that hasn't already been allocated. You can't undertake the construction of unauthorized projects. And again, you have to demonstrate that the wall, the project, would be essential to our national defense. And I would say that many people would disagree with this. And so I do think that one thing is certain, or 2 things are certain. One, that the president could declare a national emergency. He could do it. And then 2, I do think that there would be a court challenge almost immediately, right? I do think that our lower courts would be likely to not agree with the president, but I would also say that our current Supreme Court, and the current composition of the Supreme Court, I honestly am not sure how this would come out, and we saw it in the Hawaii versus Trump case relatively recently, which has to do with immigration. We saw that the Supreme Court actually was deferential to the president. And then just my last point here, these lawsuits that have been filed under the Anti-Deficiency Act. So a handful of private individuals, government employees, federal employees, as well as The National Treasury Employees Union and the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, they had filed lawsuits in the DC Federal Circuit alleging that essentially making them work during the shutdown and not paying them violates their rights under the Constitution as well as under the Anti-Deficiency Act. So what are the constitutional arguments? They have argued that basically this violates the Fifth Amendment, the Due Process Clause, which says that our government cannot deprive anyone of property without due process of law, and they're making the claim that their salary is basically a property interest, and so the government is depriving them of their property rights without due process of law. And then under the 13th Amendment, basically arguing that this amounts to slavery, right? That requiring them to work without paying amounts to slavery. And then the statutory argument is under the Anti-Deficiency Act, which bars the executive branch for spending money that hasn't been appropriated by Congress. And here the argument is, the government has made this argument that we're going to have these employees work, and we're going to use some carryover funds. Some of them are not going to be paid, some of them might be paid. And the argument is that the Anti-Deficiency Act bars this kind of action by the federal government. So we'll see. Last I looked, these lawsuits were still, proceeding, and basically the judge was not inclined to side with the government. The government basically tried to make these lawsuits go away, and the judge basically said no, we're proceeding. And there has been a status conference scheduled as of now. Now the good news is, I was teaching class right before, so I actually don't know what happened this morning. I looked at the news last night. I saw that there might have been an agreement reached at the legislative level, and that the agreement might entail funding in the amount where I saw was $1.375 billion. Remember, President Trump asked for $5.7 billion for the border wall, so the $1.375 billion would not include that amount. And so then the question is whether President Trump, agrees, or whether he says no, in which case we would have another shutdown on Friday, which I really hope we do not have.
Just to kind of put a final point on the lawsuit that was brought by the Treasury employees in Washington, D.C. here, you have to look at it from the employee's perspective. These federal employees are in the D.C. metropolitan area, and they might have an hour commute to work. So the government's asking them to work for 35 days without pay because they're deemed essential workers. And then some of them have child care issues, like I had child care issues during the 1995 shutdown. They're asking to do that all without pay.
And the other point that I was making on that point is that, so employees like, for example, Secret Service agents or the Coast Guard, I think most of us agree that those are essential employees. But the issue here is that some IRS employees will basically be called to work to essentially process tax refunds. And there's an argument to be made that, like, as much as we would all like to get refunds, preferably everybody who's getting a refund, right? As much as we would like that to happen, but that's not really an essential function. That people have a right to a refund, but there's nothing that says that you have to get it by March 15th, or that you could get it in July or August or later in the year.
Sure, thanks. So I'll just sort of qualify my comments at the outset by saying I'm not going to comment on partisan political issues, and my comments are not representative of the Coast Guard, but just of me. So I can speak to the effects of the shutdown of the Coast Guard, and again, so much more as a federal employee. So the Coast Guard is one of the nation's 5 military services, but it finds itself in the Department of Homeland Security, and thus we were subject to the lapse of funding. So we had some activities that could continue that we termed them as accepted because they weren't part of an annual appropriation. They were biannual or multi-year appropriations, or they were funded by another federal agency. And then other activities that weren't funded that we continued were accepted as it's been stated. And those essentially we categorized as national security issues or preservation of life and property. So things like law enforcement, environmental response, ports and waterways security, and things that you naturally think fall into those categories. So in terms of the employees themselves, all uniformed military members reported to work and executed their duties as normal. There was a certain small portion of civilian employees who were deemed accepted, and they were obligated to come to duties as normal, and then the vast majority of our civilian employees were furloughed. So from an organizational perspective, we did have to pare back on some of the normal daily operations that we would execute. But you can all imagine that generally operating in an uncertain budget environment is difficult to run a large organization effectively, right? So, and that happens, when there's any kind of continuing resolution, really, in terms of planning, in terms of maintenance of aircraft, ships, small boats, facilities, all of these things. It's very difficult to continue to plan and progress and move your organization forward. From a personal perspective, I'd really just echo the comments that Marlon said, and that is, it's difficult for individuals who aren't getting their paycheck to, whether they're furloughed or not furloughed, to continue to do what they're doing and put a smile on, really. I think, statutorily, the Coast Guard is obliged to do that, and I think all the Coast Guard men and women that I know, and the vast majority of our service members, take a lot of pride in doing the job that we do, and we took pride in the fact that we continue to do it throughout the duration of the shutdown. But for some folks, obviously, it's a little more difficult than others. Some of our very junior members make what could be considered below the poverty level if they're very, very junior coming into the organization. Other folks, regardless of their paycheck, may have been deployed at sea with dependents, spouses, and children left behind, things like that. So the strain, as Marlon mentioned, really isn't just on the employee, but it's on the employee's family, the employee's friends, and really the community ends up taking some strain. And one thing that I will say that's sort of a bright spot from this is the amount of support that communities provided to Coast Guard members. And really, I think geographically, the Coast Guard, we don't find ourselves too much inland, other than inland waterways and river systems. The coastal communities, particularly in the Great Lakes, I can speak to from personal experience, they care a lot about their Coast Guard and they love them. So I was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support and all the love that the Coast Guard units were getting. And from a legal perspective, obviously, we had to work through the ethical issues of being able, as federal executive employees, to manage all of those things. But ultimately, it's worth noting that I think the American public came together in a big way to support a lot of federal agencies, but in particular the Coast Guard through that.
Right, there are a number of programs in Cleveland that we have documented on our website, and also in Washington, D.C., and some metropolitan areas across the country to support federal employees during the course of the shutdown. So do we have any questions in the audience?
Can I just quickly,
Yeah, sure.
did you say something once about pro bono legal support from the bar association?
Yes, we do have a list available for those that would like to provide pro bono assistance. Because one of the challenges that federal employees may face would be navigating unemployment insurance, applying for food stamps, things that we aren't used to. So to the extent that we have attorneys that are able to help navigate that, that's a good thing. And then there's a number of issues regarding just dealing with creditors. So that's a way that pro bono lawyers can help. One of the things that's true for my job, and I'm sure true of the commander's job, is that we have intensive federal background checks in order to get our jobs. Just to give you an idea, when I started at the U.S. Attorney's Office in '92, there's an FBI agent that goes to all your former employers and interviews them, looks at your personnel file, talks to the friends of the parents of your friends. They check all of your credit. So there was a great deal of concern in the federal workforce about whether or not you're going to maintain your clearance, because as part of that process, you have to list all of your bills. If you've been behind on anything, you have to explain that. And with respect to my job, not only have to go through that FBI background check when I started, you have to go through that check every 5 years. So if there's a situation where you're not able to make your payments because of the shutdown, that could have adverse impact on you, because if you don't have your top secret clearance or whatever your level of clearance is, you cannot work. So that's an additional strain on federal workers. And it's also an additional strain on federal workers that have to juggle those thoughts and also, carry out trials or grand jury or whatever. So, if anybody else have a comment?
I was just one other thing I just wanted to mention, if the president were to declare a national emergency, actually one of my students asked me this recently, could Congress override that? And the answer is yes, but only with a 2/3 supermajority, which is really very unlikely to happen. So.
One of the things about a national emergency that we might want to discuss is the whole issue of eminent domain. How would that play in? Because a lot of the property at the border is not owned by the federal government. So where would that play in, Professor?
Yeah, so obviously, so assume that, let's say that Congress said, sure, you can have $5.7 billion, although I think the construction of a wall along the entire border, which is about 2,000 miles, would actually cost more like 30, 40, 50, 60 billion. I've seen estimates from 30 to 70 billion. So the 5.7 billion would not be enough. But assuming that we're proceeding with this, much of this land is owned by private individuals and ranchers, and so the government has to exercise eminent domain to actually, take that land with compensation in order to build. And these eminent domain cases can then linger on for years because the issue often then is compensation, right? Where the government says, you get $5, and the landowner is like, no, I want, $200,000. And then this goes to court, and there are eminent domain cases that have lingered on for decades. So this would be a huge strain on our courts and our resources. In addition, there's a lawsuit that was recently brought actually against the Trump government by a church in southern Texas, and I don't know if anybody saw this, basically saying that so if this wall is built, then the church would have to be relocated, because where the church is, it's literally this zone that would be like right next to the wall. And so the church has made the argument that this actually interferes with their free exercise of religion. So we'll see where that goes.
Marlon, I have a question.
Sorry.
So we're past the shutdown. It doesn't appear that there's going to be one on Friday, let's hope. Okay, we're a little late. But what are the lasting consequences? Like everyone who didn't get paychecks said they all didn't pay. What is the consequence for Congress and the president in their, fight? And it affected all these people for over a month, and now we've just forgotten about it and moved on. Let's give them $1 billion that we may or may not have. What is really going to change from stopping this happening again?
Let me speak to one part of that. Everyone who's accepted or not accepted people have to come to work. Those that weren't furloughed remained at home, but everybody received back pay. But the problem is, I take personal experience, is my son is a federal contractor for the Federal Aviation Administration, and contractors aren't guaranteed back pay. So that creates a substantial morale problem in the federal workforce. If you have, for example, our criminal division, they're at work every day, and the civil division is furloughed, and everyone gets paid the same. So it's a kind of the issue that I spoke about earlier about the graying federal workforce and what incentive is this for people to remain and new people to come into the workforce. Yeah.
I could just make one quick comment, not necessarily from a personal perspective, but because the Coast Guard was obliged to continue in its duties and responsibilities without the ability to spend money. When you're continuing to maintain all those things that I mentioned, you're consuming parts, consumable goods, things break, etc. And so at a certain point, in addition to the planning stopping, and all of these folks that, subject matter experts that are civilian employees that have been furloughed, that ends up having a very lasting impact as to where we will be recovering in terms of those issues for several months to be able to try and not only get back on pace with where we were in terms of productivity and effectiveness, but recover in addition to that from the loss of time and productivity. I would assume that any other federal agency that actually has facility and infrastructure and assets would encounter similar issues.
So there's two dimensions of this, right? One is consequences of the operation of the federal government and the federal workforce. And it's not a good thing for the operations of the agencies themselves. The effect of the federal workforce in terms of recruitment and so on, it's hard to imagine how it could possibly be positive, but how negative it would be, who knows? Because, what does the rest of the job market look like, and so on. And then there's other consequences, for Congress and the president. Well, first of all, I want to emphasize, they're not spending $1 billion they don't have. Right? They are in a situation where all the appropriations bills are in the context of an agreement of the total amount of appropriations that can be made for fiscal year 2019. That the agreement was made back in 2017. And by the way, if you want budget problems, just wait till they try to figure out the next year, they're going to get a total mess. But for this year, the reason they don't want to spend, that most of the people in the appropriations committees did not want to spend $5.7 billion on the wall, a lot of them think of it as that stupid wall, is because that meant they would have to take it out of something else. So, and they thought that of the things you could spend $5 billion on, the wall was really low on efficiency and sense. And so until Nancy Pelosi basically shoved it in the president's face by saying, your people don't want to vote for the wall, the Republicans, there were enough Republicans who weren't actually going for the wall, which is why it wasn't in the appropriations bills from the previous years, and it wasn't in the way the president wanted, in the appropriations bills written by Republicans for this current fiscal year. But when she made it, when she shoved it in the Republicans' face that you're not agreeing with Trump, they then went ahead and voted for it for a while. So I think that, so first of all, the reason they're not funding the $5 billion is they're not sure where else to get it. Okay, they'd have to somehow go beyond the previous total, which they could do, but they don't really want to. And then the consequences. It's really a matter of who gets the blame. What happened in 1995 was that the way the thing played out, the Republicans got the blame, and not, and in that case, it was the Republicans in Congress as opposed to Clinton. And that made them feel they didn't want to go through that again, and they deferred more to Clinton, particularly after he got reelected. Okay? I think that as it's playing so far, the calculations are not as clear as they were at the end of 1995, but I think to some extent, Republican senators at least worry a little about getting the blame. I don't know what Trump worries about at all.
That's true. Push back a little bit on the issue of federal employment. I think it's true. Maybe to a scientific certainty, we don't know the impact on federal workforce. But one of the calculations, and Commander can speak to this perhaps as well, in terms of going into federal service, is that there's an understanding that you're not going to make as much as the private sector, but the compromise is that you're going to have stability. And when you take away stability, there's possibly that's going to have an impact on individuals wanting to go into federal service.
I would completely agree with that.
Does anybody want to comment? There is some legislation, and this is what I'm hoping for. There have been some proposals by our own Senator Rob Courtney on legislation to prevent shutdowns in the future. I don't know if anybody on the panel, Professor White or anyone wants to comment on that. I think
I'm not sure how you do it without creating a default appropriation. Right, and because you have a shutdown because you don't have the money to pay people, and a default appropriation then raises all the issues of who's favored by the default or not, and there's a fairly good chance that for any given default, a substantial amount of Congress would vote for that particular version, right? So if you said automatic 3% real growth for domestic agencies, most Democrats might say, fine, okay. Or if you said automatic freeze, or and we never have an increase even for inflation and population growth for any of the agencies, I'm sure many Republicans would say, fine. On the other hand, the odds of passing any of these defaults, which requires, among other things, getting 60 votes in the Senate, really pretty low, and at least in the context of of the Joint Select Committee, basically the people on the Joint Select Committee were pretty sure that they could not pass anything of this sort. And that's why they did the trial. And you know, one of the people who testified to that committee was asked by the chairman about automatic continuing resolutions, and she said, "Well, with all due respect, Mr. Chairman, I think if you passed automatic CR legislation, you may as well disband the appropriations committees. And we lose the incentive for there to be that process of carefully looking at the funding levels for each program." And you know, putting the federal government on automatic pilot forever might not be desirable. But it's basically there's no default for which you can get, you know, the necessary vote, as far as I can tell.
Well, one of the proposals, in addition to having the situation that there is a dispute, you discontinue the prior budget. But one of the other proposals that I can speak to personally is that the proposal, at least one proposal I saw, would be that the Congress, their staff wouldn't be paid. Because my daughter works for Capitol Hill, and she's a federal employee, but they were exempted from the whole process. She got paid throughout the shutdown.
Well, I think the legislative branch bill had passed, I think, but I'm not sure. So, yeah, there's a series of these. Congress doesn't get paid. They don't have travel money. They can't adjourn, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Aside from the fact that anything of this sort would give the president power over Congress, you know, okay. Again, you've got the basic problem with defaults, which is that with bad consequences, automatic bad consequences, is that everybody thinks that means the other side should give in. And it doesn't actually determine who will give in. Until somebody gives in, you don't have a result. So again, this stuff was considered. And particularly Republicans liked the idea. Democrats did this kind of idea. Democrats didn't much. And it did not come out of the committee process.
The other thing that I was mentioning too is, to me, you know, it is somewhat sad to think that it seemed like when the shutdown first occurred, that many folks in the sort of general public who were not affected by it, were not federal employees, didn't really care as much until it was like, oh, wait a second, now it's like air traffic controllers, we're not going to be able to travel, and wait a second, it's my tax refunds. So when people who are not federal employees start to feel it personally, that's when I think they might exercise enough pressure on their representatives and perhaps on the president, although I don't know that he actually cares. But I think I read at least a few articles which talked about how when it was, you know, the air traffic controllers and IRS, that's when President Trump finally relented. That's where he had some incentive to, you know, compromise, because all of a sudden his base is being affected, and all of a sudden he's feeling pressure from his base. Otherwise, what's really sad to me is that people don't seem to really care, you know, unless they're not particularly, unless they're not personally affected.
Yeah, so if you have the kind of consequences that cause legislators from both sides to have their own constituencies say, we'd rather settle this and not get what we want in terms of policy than keep fighting this in the effort to get what we want, whether it's a wall or something else. Yeah, then you get a settlement, but it takes a while to get to that point. And I think it's right. I think, you know, when people in the TSA started calling in sick, I think that had an effect. And by the way, that also has an effect on senators, members of the House, because who lies a lot?
Yeah, another thing is that in terms of the federal employees calling in, a lot of my federal employees just have to make the economic decision. Do I spend money out of my pocket to get gas, to pay for parking when I'm not getting paid? And just before this shutdown ended, there were 14,000 Treasury employees, you know, particularly in our larger cities where the expenses are a lot higher. It said, I just can't afford to do this. In addition to the gas and transportation, wherever I have childcare, like was my situation in 1995, or a spouse that's giving birth. So that's a big part of it as well. We have about 5 minutes left. Why don't we see if there's any other questions? If not, maybe we can have everyone give a few minutes closing. Want to start with the commander and then kind of work our way?
Sure. Any questions for me? Okay. Well, I really appreciate taking the time to be here. I think that obviously it's an important issue that we all should be focused on. Just echoing your point in terms of personal impact it has on the public. I don't necessarily know how to fix that, but I certainly agree with the sentiment that, ultimately, oftentimes it's very easy to take for granted the service that federal workers provide to the public, unless you're one of those federal workers or you are intimately affected by them on a daily basis. But moving forward, I think that we just all encourage folks to be actively engaged in the process and recognize that there is a real impact, whether you see it or not, on not just the individuals who are federal employees, but the government as a whole and its effectiveness and the good stewardship of the taxpayers' dollars that are being spent and will be spent with this organization.
I would just like to follow up on this issue of national emergencies. Can President Trump declare one, and if so, is that legal, and what happens next? I think there's general consensus among all scholars, lawyers, that yes, presidents ought to be able to declare a national emergency, but I think there's also fairly general consensus that they really ought to do so only if there actually is a national emergency, right? That they should not do so if there isn't one. And when you compare what's happening now at the southern border, you might say there's a humanitarian crisis, right? That there are people who are coming, that they're refugees, economic migrants, and it's a humanitarian issue. But I think that most people don't believe that we actually have a national emergency taking place. And if you compare this to, for example, the Iranian hostage crisis, you compare this to 9/11, I would argue that the two situations are drastically different, and that basically our presidents should not usurp their authority to declare national emergencies where there isn't one. And actually wrote this out, if I can find it, Justice Jackson wrote in his dissent in the Korematsu case in 1944. Remember, in Korematsu, basically the majority of the Supreme Court declared that the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II was actually legal, constitutional. Justice Jackson dissented, and he said, each emergency power lies about like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need. And so his argument really was that emergency powers should not be abused, right? This is exactly why we have three branches of government, right? This is why power is supposed to be shared among the branches. And so my only hope is that if we are in a situation where President Trump does declare national emergency, my hope is that the judiciary then actually exercises their role and does a thorough review of that and hopefully comes out on the side of, this wasn't unconstitutional, this wasn't authorized by federal statute.
I think I want to emphasize that we have no idea what the Supreme Court would do in this situation. That there's a very strong argument that this is not a national emergency, but then again, who gets to decide? And there's probably some likelihood of deference to the president's definition. And I have no idea where that would fall with the Supreme Court. I have no doubt that a district court will give standing to the House when the House sues, just as the district court gave standing to the House when the House sued over Obama's cost-sharing subsidies, which are arguably at least as questionable, but also justifiable on other grounds. So we don't know what will play out, of course. I just want to end on a really downer note. If you think this situation is bad, remember that first of all, the debt ceiling suspension expires in about a month or a month and a half. And secondly, that we still have the Budget Control Act in force with its long-term caps of discretionary spending, domestic and defense, and which are totally unrealistic. And because they're totally unrealistic, 2 years ago, Congress and the President temporarily raised them by about $60 billion each for defense and domestic. But for the appropriations for 2020, they're going to have to raise them again because it has reverted to the original 2011 Act level. And so they have to somehow find a way to have any kind of appropriations for next year. Remember, for this year, which we're in the middle of, we have DOD appropriations, we have labor HHS appropriations, we have some others. They're not going to be able to do anything without a really big deal that hopefully settles the BCA cap issues and does something about the debt ceiling. And you can just look at them and see how likely you think that is.
Yeah, I would just like to end by just, I don't know how many federal employees we have in the audience or that are watching online, but I've had the privilege of being a federal employee for the past 26 years. I can just say there's something dedicated and talented federal workers, and they don't deserve what happened with the shutdown. So we just want to thank you for your service and continued work on behalf of the people of the country. And then second of all, I just want to just encourage everyone here in the audience and also everyone looking online that it's just so critical that our young people, like my son and my daughter, continue to look beyond themselves and serve the federal government. We don't want to do anything that's going to discourage a future generation, our best and bright team of important work of serving as a federal employee of the United States. So again, I want to thank this outstanding panel, and so let's give them a round of applause for coming today. And unless there are any further questions, we are adjourned. Thank you.